Good evening, good afternoon, and morning to all the participants, panelists, and government officials who are joining us to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN and to explore how the UN can and should partner with the global community of think tanks. This is a truly exceptional gathering with over 525 participants from every region of the world. I want to thank our keynote speakers and all the panelists who have prepared remarks for today's gathering and have taken time out of their busy schedules to help us mark this momentous occasion. The program is designed to underscore the important role think tanks can and should play in helping address the range of transnational issues we face. The gathering of the world's leading think tanks is intended to demonstrate the intellectual, problem-solving, and associational energy of the global think tank community. The message I hope to communicate is that think tanks have been helping and will continue to help the UN meet the daunting global challenges we face and to support the UN in its global mission. In addition, it is an opportunity to underscore the importance of multilateralism, international cooperation, and the value and importance of IGOs, TNCs, and NGOs in combating transnational threats. I hope we can demonstrate the value of forging meaningful institutional partnerships with the UN and why the UN should make it easier for think tanks and other policy-oriented NGOs to help the UN think and act more effectively. The program is divided into 4 segments. The first will outline why we should remain committed to international cooperation and multilateral institutions. The second will explore how think tanks and other experts have helped the UN in a number of areas over the last 75 years. The third segment will suggest concrete ways that the UN can partner with think tanks to address some of the enduring and emerging problems we face. And finally, we will hear from the Undersecretary General, who will call for collaboration and action. The response from the global think tank community has been strong, very positive, and supportive of this event. And for that reason, the UN should not miss this opportunity to forge meaningful and lasting partnerships with the over 525 think tanks and policy-oriented NGOs that are in the audience today. This is especially true and urgent given the global challenges we face and the resource constraints that the UN will face now and the future. It needs our partnership. Due to time and digital platform constraints, I've asked all the panelists and speakers to respect the following ground rules. Each panelist has been asked to be aware of the severe time constraints and to keep to the time allotted for your segment of the program. You will be notified at the 2-minute mark, and once you have completed your remarks, you're asked to shut your mic off to improve quality. I asked all participants to shut off your mics and video during the program, once again, given the large number of participants, to help improve the sound quality and the visuals of this program. We apologize, but for logistical and resource constraints, it made it impossible to provide simultaneous translation. The meeting will be conducted in English. Time is limited, so we request that the panelists refrain from making advertisements for your organization and focus on providing concrete examples, proposals, and recommendations for the 525 people who are attending this program. That is why they are here. There are now over 500, as of this morning, 25 policymakers, senior think tank executives, and scholars, IGOs, corporations, and philanthropists who are here today to hear how we can address the daunting transnational threats we face and how to create a secure and sustainable future. Let the celebration and the discussion begin. I am pleased to introduce Kevin Rudd, our keynote speaker today. As you all know, Kevin is the former Prime Minister of Australia and the President of the Asian Society Policy Institute in New York. He personifies what the program is all about, working tirelessly to bridge the world of ideas and the world of politics. He and John Allen and others are classic examples of what I have described as the revolving door, who have gone from government into think tanks to think deeply and profoundly about the challenges we face domestically and internationally, and have committed themselves and their institutions to making the world a better place. I've asked him to say a few words about the 75th anniversary and to be constructively provocative about what we can do to help the UN act and think more effectively in the years ahead. Kevin?
Good. Well, thank you very much, Jim, and greetings to all of you from Australia. It's late in the evening here, but I've had a drink or two. I hope that lubricates the remarks which are about to follow. Jim, thank you, first of all, and the University of Pennsylvania's Think Tanks and Civil Societies program. Thank you for actually dedicating your efforts to encouraging those of us who are in the think tank community. There are very few academic institutions who do that. You're one of them, and you do it in an important way. So thanks for your pastoral care and intellectual interest in what we are seeking to do by adding value to the public policy process around the world. And it's good to see such a great roll-up of people from the other think tanks. You've just mentioned John Allen, Sir Robin Niblet, Fred Kempe, Thierry Montbrial, and the others from institutions around the world. So greetings to all of my colleagues and thank them for the work that they're doing in a very crowded public policy space right now. 75th anniversary of the UN, not a small anniversary. And rather than fill it with platitudes about what the UN has done over 75 years, let me just make one core point. That is, in the history of international organizations, this is a very long-lasting organization. The League didn't really make 20 years. Various attempts at international organizations survived poorly in the 19th century. And the fabric of international society, so-called, was one of rolling bloodshed, violence, poverty, and war. So this experiment in what the founders called the Parliament of Man, or now the Parliament of Humankind, is actually quite precious from an historical perspective. The second point I'd make is simply this. Therefore, we cannot, as a matter of logic, given history, just assume that it is automatically self-regenerating for decades and decades into the future, unless we are permanently engaged in the business of creative and intelligent reinvention. Reinvention, which occurs obviously with personnel, with structures, but most critically with ideas, and that's where we come in as a think tank community. And my third point is that the UN, embodying within it the essential concept of multilateralism, is itself under threat from friendly fire, the posture of the current US administration, and traditionally hostile fire from a range of governments and institutions around the world. And so therefore, for those of us who support the idea of multilateralism, which is we get better enduring public policy responses by having the collective governments of the world agree, that concept itself needs to be husbanded and protected by our think tank work into the future. So for those three reasons, Jim, bringing us together is critical at this time, because the fact that we've had 75 years doesn't mean we're automatically going to be around, or the institution will be around for its 100th. A few further remarks. What is the specific utility which think tanks can offer the United Nations organization? I think like what think tanks offer their domestic governments, if we conceptualize it as A, the ability genuinely to hone an idea on the part of UN leaders, B, to road test ideas through a think tank where it may be too difficult, frankly, to do so either as the UN proper or even as individual governments. And thirdly, to enable for think tanks to work on better methods of actual program delivery for the UN institutions. And when we look at the history, I think we should encourage ourselves by this. Look at, for example, Leo Pazvolsky from Brookings, who shaped very much the Marshall Plan after the Second World War from a think tank. Look very much at the work of Raphael Lamkin, previously Carnegie's president, and the work done on genocide, which gave rise to the 48 Genocide Convention. Look at the work currently done by CIGI in Canada, and Rohinton Medora is with us, and the tracking and tracing work done on both the G7 and the G20. These are really important functions. So we should be encouraged by what has happened in times past to give us encouragement also for what is to come. I'd also like to say at the outset, Jim, we should value the reforms which have been brought in by Secretary General Guterres already to open the institution to wider thinking. It's not a closed shop down at Turtle Bay, it's an open shop. And those of us who have ideas, I've never known the door to be pushed shut to anyone of good heart and good mind bringing forward an idea to the institution. And I think that door remains well and truly open today. In my remaining time is in providing these opening remarks, Jim, let me reflect on just a few ideas where I think we could perhaps add further value in the future. 4 or 5 quick ideas. They may or may not be relevant to what your subsequent panelists and speakers will take on, but I simply offer them as a constructive response to the invitation you've just made to everybody, which is how do we move the dial forward in this conference rather than repeat ancient nostrums from the past. Idea number 1, the UN might consider establishing its own Council of Councils to more systematically harness the best ideas from the world's think tank communities. A number of national governments do that. If, for example, there are a dozen or so think tanks in the peace and security space, in the national security space within a given country, it is often the case where the presidents or the senior leaders of those institutions form a council for the head of government concerned. So my suggestion to our friends in Turtle Bay is think about a council of councils. You select who you wish to be there, but there are a bunch of institutions, not just in the United States, but around the world, who seek to think constructively and creatively about the multilateral agenda. The second proposal that I'd like the colleagues to perhaps to consider is how do we best institutionally organize the question of harnessing our collective intelligence? I've just spoken about a council of councils, but within that, what systems can we develop to best, as it were, absorb the lessons from the past and creatively apply them to the future so we have rolling institutional knowledge? And I'll draw colleagues' attention to, I think, a very thought-provoking book by a friend and colleague of mine from the United Kingdom, Jeff Mulgan, on the question of collective intelligence. It's about a year or so old, but it's about how institutions harness their collective intelligence and those which therefore best creatively and adaptively survive into the future. The third idea is, can the UN secure greater funding support to build and enhance its own policy planning staff? I know enough about how the UN works and how national governments work to know that so much of the work is reactive because stuff is constantly flying in the door or through the window. But at the same time, it's necessary with a forward planning staff to engage in reasonable, not idealistic or unrealistic medium to long-term scenario planning. Now, if you look at one practical case in point, the UNFCCC does this really well with the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists by putting out quintennial reports which go to how the planet is as a forward-looking perspective for policymakers. But applying that model more broadly across the other pillars of the UN's work, both in human rights and peace and security, as well as in sustainable development, may be useful. How do we therefore fund the UN to have a genuinely significant long-term policy planning staff? That's my third idea. Two quick ones to conclude with, and then let's get on with the rest of the conversation. I think also one of the things that the multilateral system currently struggles with is this. Given that around the world, right-wing populism in particular has as its number one target so-called globalism, so-called multilateralism, so-called unelected governments, how do we creatively as think tanks then help the United Nations system to build the public support base for the next generation of multilateralism around the world? Rather than just relying upon the good stories from the high school history books about Dag Hammarskjöld and the founding of the UN back in 1945 and the Atlantic Charter giving rise to the UN Charter, all of which is good stuff. The creative challenge that I see is how do we as think tanks help the UN think through how to build their own long-term public political constituency around the world in order to give national lawmakers within those countries, frankly, a body of support, encouragement, and sometimes admonition to lay off UN bashing. There are some recent experiences of that in terms of the European Union. And very finally, my thought is this, Jim. Often the focus of internal UN reform exercises turns immediately to questions of institutional reform, structural reform, bureaucratic reform, and change. I'm not opposed to institutional innovation, but I know it is a very big graveyard. I chaired the Independent Commission on Multilateralism for the International Peace Institute for 2 years between 14, 15 and into 16. And I know for a fact that from talking to so many people in the system, one set of recommendations after the other about how to change the structures may excite people. It may cause a lot of academic and analytical interest. But I think by and large, it misses the essential question. And that is, however imperfect the current structures of the United Nations system are, and I quarantine here the Security Council as its own unique bucket of problems. But the rest of the institution, the General Assembly, the specialized agencies, and the rest of the multilateral system, I think the challenge is not trying to create the perfect institution. The structures which currently exist are probably as best as we're ever going to come up with. The real value added, I believe, that comes from the think tank community, helping our friends in the UN is this. How do we creatively work with our friends in the UN to think through ways in which we can use coalitions of the policy willing, coalitions of the politically willing, from creative countries and creative powers around the world to unblock the logjams of the current system. In other words, now you've seen something of this from the Franco-German proposal about an alliance on multilateralism, which was developed over the course of the last year and a half. But taking that further, are there other ways in which we as think tanks can help the UN, as it were, harness coalitions of the policy willing across geographies, across normal systems, in order to come up with innovative ways to unblock the UNFCCC negotiations, to unlock the, if you like, outside the UN, the WTO reform process? I think that's a fifth area which would be worth consideration. I'll conclude my remarks there, Jim, but to conclude where I began, thank you for being concerned about two things. One is the future of the UN multilateral system, and two, how we as think tanks value add into that. And I commend you again in the University of Pennsylvania and your program for taking this on your shoulders. I congratulate you for the event.
Kevin, thank you very much, as always, on point and providing much food for thought, and as a wonderful start to this celebration and discussion of how think tanks can partner with the UN to help make the world a better place. I now turn to my friend and partner, Rohinton Madhora, the president of CIGI. Rohinton.
Jim, thank you. It's always good to join you and colleagues from around the world to discuss the kinds of issues that we need to make, frankly, the world and everything around us that much better. What I thought I'd do in less than 5 minutes is reflect on the very thoughtful, as always, remarks of Kevin Rudd, and provide a bridge to the rest of the morning or evening's program. It strikes me that to say the blindingly obvious, if the UN didn't exist, we would want to create it. And so let's always keep that in mind, that we don't miss something until it's gone. And it's easy to sort of throw popcorn at things that don't work well. But that is not the same as saying the only way we'd be better off is by not having them. And our job as a global community and as think tanks is to improve things, not necessarily always eliminate them. And so I'm thinking, reflecting on the political nature of the UN, what Kevin said, the world's parliament, and then it's roll up your sleeves and technical work through the specialized agencies. And what all of that has in common, of course, is the knowledge creation, knowledge translation, and impact. And when you think about that, that's pretty much what we as think tanks say we're about as well. And so what we as think tanks who are not part of the UN system do, because the UN does have its own think tanks within it as well. I'm in the process of reviewing one of them, wider in Helsinki currently, is to provide that inside-outside perspective. And that in practice means 2 or 3 things. The first thing it means is to think ahead and to keep ideas alive. Kevin mentioned the creation of the G20 at the leaders level as one such example, where several think tanks, CIGI included, reflected on how, after the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, a G20 was created at the central bank and finance ministers level to reflect the changing power structures and decision-making structures globally. And then so projected that forward and said, what might the next step be? And you combine that with the fact that the G7 was seen as somewhat exclusive and spent, and so the G20 idea emerged. A lot of think tanks spent over a decade thinking through what a G20 at the leaders level might look like. At the end of the day, I don't think anyone would pretend that it was the good work of think tanks alone that led to the creation of the G20. It was the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And so back to my point about thinking ahead, keeping ideas alive so that when the moment comes, they're there, and we're not scrambling to make it up as we go along. And so I think that's a thoughtful projection of ideas and being well positioned to be opportunistic when the time comes is something that's important. And I'd make the same point, by the way, about issues like carbon pricing, about issues like advanced market commitments, and more broadly, the incentives to innovate, which is what's driving COVAX currently. I don't think we'd have a COVAX if we didn't have think tanks in the last 20 years thinking about changes in the global IP system and in questions of technological spillovers. The second thought that occurs to me is that when I think of the main issues that we confront, climate change, financial instability, pandemics, these are complex issues that bring together science, social science, non-science, if you will, power, and other such intangibles. And to understand all of that, we need an interdisciplinary yet rigorous process to analyze what the issue might be, provide options, and then seek a way forward. And that, again, in many ways, is, in a nutshell, the charter that animates many of us in the think tank world. The third and final point I'd make is that we are in the business of knowledge translation. And so we have all of these big complex issues that come with their own jargon and come with their own complexities. And we need to translate that for our national parliaments, for the world's parliament, for whoever. And I think think tanks, more than anyone else, are well positioned to do that, to not just speak truth to power, but actually to speak that truth in a way that people understand it. And we should never forget that we're not just speaking to each other, but speaking to people from a wide range of backgrounds and expertises. And our job is to make sure that people talk to each other through us and understand that in the real world, it is not departments of economics or physics that find solutions. It's something much more amorphous and complex. And so I'd end on that point. All of these require a supply, which is what think tanks do, and a demand. There will be points in time when the demand simply doesn't exist. We cannot push on a string, but we keep having to try, which is where our independence and our own power, so to speak, comes in. But we also, it is imperative on us to create the climate in which we're not pushing on a string, in which the supply creates its own demand. And so back to my point about thinking ahead, complexity, and communication. With those few thoughts, Jim, back to you. But thank you again for having us.
Thank you very much, Rohinton. I want to point out at this point that in terms of pulling this program together, there was a very conscious effort to make sure that there was gender, political, institutional, and regional balance, and also a balance between the established powers in the world and emerging powers, and a range of voices that are diverse, as we have already seen and will continue to see in terms of the program. We have a host of excellent women on the panel, and I will now turn to Tatiana and to Tom for a look at where we have been in terms of institutions helping the UN think, and where are some of the challenges that lie ahead. Tatiana?
Hi, Jim. Am I on?
You are on.
Okay, I'm
Tatiana, you are not. So your mic is up. Now you're on.
I'm on.
Okay.
I'm on. I think Tom will lead us off, and I'll follow.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Jim. Others who are going to follow are going to provide some specific illustrations. You ask us to provide the history of what's going on and the context for the future. So I'll do part one. Tatiana will do part two. I think the important thing is that ever since the ink was drying on the charter 75 years ago, reform has been on the agenda. Guterres is included in this. They emphasize management operations, which are not the topic today, and frankly, not the UN's comparative advantage, at least not in our view. And after 15 University Press books and 100 interviews under the auspices of the UN Intellectual History Project, Don't misunderstand me. How could you be against better peacekeeping operations or inoculations for kids? But the main legacy, the main multiplier comes from formulating ideas, norms, standards, principles, and monitoring and reporting on them. This is, of course, the topic for today, and where think tanks and other outside purveyors of ideas come in. This is what Richard Jolly, who's been involved with this, and Tatiana and I called about 10 years ago the third UN, or the supportive group of non-state actors. That's not just think tanks, but intellectuals, scholars, consultants, NGOs, for-profit sector, and the media. You should note that the adjective third UN is in quotes, because in fact, this is not the way most analysts look at the world body. Ever since Innes Claude wrote a textbook in the 50s, there was only the member states and international civil servants. To state the obvious, partnerships are essential at any time, but particularly now in the midst of this pandemic. $8 to $10 trillion drop in global economic and global GDP in the face of nationalism, populism, etc. They're always necessary. We say somewhere in the book that you've been kind enough to mention here that we're both optimists. You have to be in this business. And even at this awful moment in the United States, the latest authoritative survey from the Chicago Council points to the fact that about 2/3 of Americans, brought down somewhat by flat earthers, are in favor of more cooperation, more collaboration with bodies like the UN to fight the obvious challenges of COVID and climate and other issues. So, partnerships have long been important to help the UN think, which is why we've written this book. But it's especially pressing at a moment when politicians and pundits and the public are looking for answers. And not to put too fine on a point on it, and here I think I disagree with Kevin, the World Organization is largely missing in action on this front. So, if the central task is to push out intellectual and policy envelopes, our topic today, to venture beyond for what passes for conventional intergovernmental wisdom, then the UN has a decades-long history of originating, incubating, consuming, disseminating big ideas, from human rights to full employment, from climate to the limits of GDP to measure what we're up to. Almost invariably, if you look at the record, the ideas themselves and the pressures to adopt them come from outside governments and outside secretariats, from what we call the third UN, including, of course, think tanks. There have been think tanks around the UN from the beginning, even before the beginning. The Carnegie Endowment looked at the League and tried to pull out the lessons for the post-war era. I think it's worth reciting and quoting the remarks from the 38th floor before he took office in a publicity for what was going to happen. And this is a quote: "We will be open to new ideas, drawing on and commissioning research and inputs from a wide variety of internal and external sources." These are fine words, but they have not, in my view, met with adequate follow-up. And so I think I differ here again with Kevin, because if past is prelude, the most creative and imaginative rethinking comes from outside member states and outside the Secretariat from the third UN. That includes think tanks. Frankly, thinking outside any box is not in the job description of Secretariat members or governments. We're trying to keep all 193 member states happy all the time. This is the job of think tanks and the other members of the third UN. They're smaller usually, more flexible, better networked, and less bound by constraints. So that's the past. What are the challenges facing us this week and next for partnerships with the UN? And Tatiana is going to answer that question. Thanks, Jim.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Great, thanks, Tom. And many thanks to Jim for bringing us all together today. Let me say first that partnerships are not new to the UN. In fact, most parts of the UN system maintain some kind of partnerships, formal or ad hoc. But the second UN can still make better use of outside knowledge networks and draw on networks of first-class intellectuals worldwide. So what kinds of intellectual partnerships do we need today at a moment of such momentous global change? And what are some of the challenges? So Jim has asked us for some takeaways. There are many, but we'll offer 5. The first takeaway is the value of knowledge brokers. In our book, The Third UN, we explore the value of think tanks and knowledge brokers, among others, in helping the UN think. Now, knowledge brokering is multidimensional. In addition to producing knowledge through in-house research, knowledge brokers are responsible for moving knowledge from the academy and think tanks to governments and UN secretariats. This often requires identifying, producing, and curating research. It also requires translation, as we've already heard, and convening to facilitate the transfer of necessary knowledge for policymakers to effectively address specific problems. The Third UN's think tanks and knowledge brokers serve not only as bridges between evidence and policy, but increasingly between policymakers and their publics. This is essential to bring governments along, especially when the global cooperation we so desperately need from member states today is in such short supply. The second takeaway is the politics of knowledge. Now, the push for evidence-based policymaking has raised the political stakes of who gets to help the UN think. Whose knowledge is most valued and why? This is important not only for UN policymaking, but also for international norm development and dissemination. Okay, that knowledge and power are linked is not new, but this is why think tanks and knowledge brokers around the UN have an ethical responsibility to be particularly attuned to the politics and hierarchies of knowledge and to their own positions within the knowledge hierarchy. Now, this self-reflection is as essential to the credibility of think tanks as it is to any social research. The third takeaway is the need for new voices. Now, the underlying principles, approaches, and values that will shape global governance, institutions, and norms will be partly determined by who's setting the rules, and more specifically, who's contributing new thinking to help shape and respect those rules. Powerful states understand this, hence the pushback against diversifying perspectives. And we have a moral and practical obligation to diversify networks of experts and go beyond the usual suspects in elite universities or in the global north. Now, this doesn't mean simply privileging local perspectives, but rather genuinely widening perspectives. Diversifying the voices within the Third UN with access to UN policy debates is necessary not only because ideas should reflect the planet's diversity, but also because Third UN actors can help build bridges between relevant stakeholders. These bridges span secretariats and governments and their publics. Now, this is why there's a particularly compelling need, we think, to strengthen partnerships with actors and knowledge networks, not just in states that have been traditional supporters of multilateralism, but also challengers to the liberal status quo. Our fourth takeaway is that the vehicles for ideas also matter. For example, commissions of eminent persons and high-level panels need to be demand-driven so that there are ready-made consumers for the products. The most effective ones have occurred when governments were searching for alternative approaches or looking to build new coalitions. But also less visible and off-the-record deliberations also have their place in helping the UN think. They've often been crucial, yet out of the limelight, and often deliberately so. And let's not forget the revolving door of human capital and the transfer of ideas.
Minutes remaining.
That is, it's no longer unusual for former government officials to assume positions within UN secretariats, or for NGO practitioners to assume similar posts, or for academics to serve on long or short-term contracts. The fifth and final takeaway grows from the current scramble for funds. Trends in research funding complicate our business enormously. Philanthropies increasingly no longer fund basic research, and previously generous member states are tightening their belts, under pressure from their own taxpayers to justify investments in applied research. This is only likely to get worse under COVID. Now, the growing practice of donor-driven research and high-impact philanthropy is setting agendas and demanding quick results that can be problematic for the pace and process of valid scientific inquiry. The growing trend for consultants and research on demand can be deadly for research design and practice, and for the independence of research. So funding challenges, together with a warp speed of the communication of information and disinformation, mean that think tanks and other research institutions will need to change how we do business. Where will the funding come from to support research, especially if the evidence runs contrary to donor wishes, and perspectives. So the third UN will need to create a demand for basic research from within the first and second UNs, make persuasive cases to funders for the value of evidence, and be more transparent about funding sources and conditions. A compelling need, therefore, for all of us as we think about intellectual partnerships will be to rethink research funding partnerships as well. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you. And thank you, Tom, for giving us your perspective and the historical and current perspective of the challenges that we face, but we should dedicate ourselves as institutions to overcome. I now turn the program over to Brian Finley, the president of the Stimson Center, who will take us through a range of institutions that have been and continue to work on some of the most daunting issues and challenges we face. Brian?
Thanks, Jim. And as always, a big thanks to the incomparable, the one and only Jim McGann for bringing us all together. We're really so grateful to you, Jim, for the remarkable service that you provide to the sector. Truly grateful, and you've done it, I think, once again here today. As Jim mentioned, we're going to spend kind of the next 40 minutes or so hearing from 6 different colleagues from peer organizations around the world about their own experiences, but also specifically, as and I think we've kicked it off really nicely, Jim, about, we're going to hear a little bit from them about their proposals and recommendations as well for how think tanks have addressed some of the global issues that we have touched in direct partnership with the UN, and in the McGann way, they will speak specifically and give some very clear examples of how their institutions have collaborated with the UN. Needless to say, we're clearly operating at a moment when the global counter reaction to globalization continues to threaten the multilateral system that, well, clearly imperfect, as we have heard already, I think has nonetheless demonstrated significant upsides for global security, for development, for poverty reduction, and so many of the other objectives, not just across the Sustainable Development Goals, but much more broadly as well. For our part at Stimson, for more than 30 years, the organization has really worked alongside the UN and other global institutions as well to try to pump some air back into the tire of multilateralism, and in many cases, and particularly at this moment, oftentimes and occasionally, at least, in lieu of governments, national governments once sacrosanct role. So my Stimson colleagues have been busy not just generating proposals for reforms to the system, to Tom's earlier point, but in some cases working directly with the UN, the affiliated agencies themselves to try to carry some water on their behalf. It may be training peacekeepers, it's collaborating with the council itself on non-proliferation issues, on building alternative energy sources to power UN operations abroad and so forth. And so maybe just by quick example, building upon the recent UN 75 Global Governance Forum, my colleagues are in the process of standing up a new global governance innovation research and policy network. And I really hope that will become an opportunity for all of us on this at this meeting to convene and to amplify the voices of a new generation of scholars and policy researchers, including from the Global South, most notably to study and advance some institutional policy and normative improvements to the system of global governance. So we're looking forward to telling you more about that. And as I say, I really hope that you'll all be part of that moving forward. But with that, though, let me turn to this pretty remarkable panel that Jim and his colleagues have pulled together. And Vasu, I'd maybe like to start with you, if I may. Vasu, of course, is the founder and executive director of the African Center for Constructive Resolution and Disputes. And Vasu, your organization has worked with the UN, of course, for decades on, I think, one of the key objectives, of course, to the maintenance of international peace and security. So I wonder if I could just ask you a two-part question. Specifically, what are the areas that your institution, Accord, has collaborated with the UN around? And a second part, what is the value add? What is the value add that Accord and think tanks more broadly have brought to the UN, and how effective have you been in that collaboration?
Great, thank you very much, Brian. And again, let me say thank you to Jim, the ever energetic Jim, always doing really great things for the think tank community. Brian, let me start by saying a little bit about Accord's role with the UN. We have been working with the UN system now for over 24 years. We work with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, with the UN Peace Building Support Office, with the Mediation Support Unit, UNHCR, UNDP, all in different capacities. And then, of course, with the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, which attempts to influence the United Nations in terms of its policies towards Africa. And we have a very close relationship with OSA as well. Now, our engagement with the UN has typically been a combination of knowledge generation, training and curriculum development, policy seminars, and contributing to UN Security Council debates. And we've done, I think, now around 4 UN Security Council debates, and then attending and presenting at a number of UN meetings across the world. With the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, we have been involved in a Norwegian-sponsored project called the Training for Peace, now in its 25th year. And we have developed the curriculum for the senior mission leaders of the United Nations training mission, rather peacekeeping missions around the world. And we've also developed the UN Civil Affairs Handbook. We train almost all UN missions in Africa, go through Accord's trainings. On the Peace Building Support Office, we have partnered with UN PBSO on all its 5-year reviews, arranging the Africa consultations for those reviews. The last review was done virtually in June this year. Inputs from these consultations go into the report of the UN Secretary General that he presents to the UN General Assembly. So in a sense, we have a direct input into the UNSG's report. We work, as I said, closely with the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, holding joint expert meetings almost 2 or 3 a year to empower OSA with expert knowledge to strengthen its advocacy role on behalf of Africa at the UN. Now, coming to the value add, Brian, I think in the field of peace and security, given the demands globally, and Kevin Rudd spoke to that when he said, you know, they're really on a treadmill every day, and the increasing demands over the next decade, UN staff are often overwhelmed with responding to crisis and don't get much time for reflection. I mean, we've worked with them over the years, and we know what that treadmill looks like. Our experience has been that UN staff find it difficult to manage their crisis on a day-to-day basis and find collaboration with think tanks useful in that it gives them time and space to reflect on their work and challenges outside of the crisis management environment that they work in. So we found a lot of these retreats that we have with UN staff, whether that's you know, outside of New York or whether that's in some other part of the world, really gives them time to reflect and work with peers across the world on lessons learned, and allows them, I think, to also become creative and innovative. What are the challenges then, Brian, that we're facing? I think separating fake news today from fact is the greatest challenge that the UN will face in the area of peace and security, since here it is a matter of life and death, literally, when they're dealing with matters of peace and security. So think tanks can assist by providing evidence-based information for analysis and the designing of strategies. And we at Accord have been playing this role. And since March 2020, we have established and are field testing a data analytics capability to meet this challenge. We have also established networks on the ground in all 55 countries in Africa to strengthen verification and ensure contextual knowledge. We produce this in a COVID-19 conflict and resilience monitor, and we have been collaborating now with the UN. So that's directly inputting knowledge into the UN system, as well as here with the African Union and the regional organizations. And then lastly, a recommendation. I think building on from what Kevin Rudd had suggested, I think that this webinar on the 75th anniversary of the UN can be used as a platform to build an informal bridge to the UN and to work with the UN to develop a modus operandi for the UN system and think tanks to collaborate and support each other while maintaining our respective independence. So I think, I mean, that would be important for the UN and for its member states, and that would be important for us as independent think tanks as well. Thank you very much, Brian.
Vasi, that's really helpful. I wish we had another 40 minutes to go in a little bit more detail with some of the remarkable work that Accord has done. I wonder if in 30 seconds, I wonder if you have a specific example of, can you give us just a little texture on kind of what that sort of engagement directly with the UN missions looks like?
I mean, we have we have worked very closely with UNHCR in Burundi, for example. UNHCR has supported us to work with returning refugees, and together with UNHCR, we established 5 field offices in the rural areas to receive refugees who now coming back after 20 years were claiming their land from people who were already settled, and Accord over a 7-year period working with UNHCR have mediated all of those agreements. So we literally trained 80 mediators on the ground. These are paralegals or lawyers in Burundi, and then have them staff those offices. So this has been real good collaboration, and it's also given us lessons for other parts of the world, not just in Africa, but in other parts of the world where returning refugees might come back, and that leads to conflict, where there's a conflict of interest between settled residents and returning refugees.
Thanks, Vasi. Remarkable work. Yusuf, maybe I could turn to you next. Yusuf Mahmoud is, of course, Senior Advisor, the International Peace Institute in Tunisia. So, Yusuf, maybe we could just stick with the security theme here for a moment. Your organization, IPI, has been focused on peace operations, of course, for the better part of 50 years, I think. I wonder if you could walk us a little bit through the areas of your work stream, specifically, again, with the UN, that have been, let's say, most appreciated by the UN community. And can you give, again, some concrete examples of how IPI has undertaken that collaboration?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jim, for bringing us together. To stick to the allotted time, Brian, I will provide one integrated answer to both questions. As you properly said, peacekeeping and peace operations in general have indeed been part of IPI's DNA since its creation in 1970. It remains so to this day, given the sustained attention of the international community to this most visible, relatively costly, and at times controversial, I must say, pillar of UN's work. This activity is carried out by a dedicated center for peace operations that draws on the expertise and experience of a small team of staff members and non-resident fellows, some of whom have served in UN peacekeeping operations. The center is responsible for at least 10 activities. Let me mention only 3 that have been appreciated by the UN community. The first one is a multi-year project that focuses on prioritization and sequencing of Security Council mandates. This usually takes the form of closed-door discussions that enable independent, informed, and open exchanges among member states and UN Secretariat officials prior to mandate renewal of major multidimensional peacekeeping operations. The ultimate aim is to ensure realistic mandates, not always successfully, but at least as realistically as possible so they can be effectively delivered. From the feedback we receive, this activity has been particularly appreciated by a good number of elected members of the Security Councils who do not usually have the needed staff capacity to make informed contributions to mandate renewal discussions. The second activity or program focuses on issues relating to the protection of civilians, POC in short. It seeks to support the UN Secretariat in analyzing the challenges facing peace operations mandated to protect civilians and making recommendations on how to improve the delivery of POC mandates. It produces a variety of issue briefs and policy papers and convenes different types of discussions, both in New York and in the field, to gather lessons learned and best practices relating to POC. As a result of this and other contribution, as IPI, we think, has become the go-to think tank on POC issues. As evidence is the discussions going on right now between IPI colleagues and an independent senior consultant recently appointed by the UN to look into the future of POC. In pursuit of these and other activities, IPI has used its virtual convening capacities to enhance partnership with other think tanks, including the Stimson, to reach out to local knowledge when digital connections make it possible. The third and final area that has recently gained prominence is a series of prospective and retrospective studies and analyses carried out either independently or at the request of the UN Department of Peace Operations and the Executive Office of the Secretary General. One such request is for IPI to play a convening role this fall on the future of peacekeeping in the next decade. At a time when UN peacekeeping has to navigate once again a divided Security Council, growing disagreement over normative principles, a financial and pandemic crisis, the UN community, including the UN Secretariat, have few opportunities, let alone time, as Vasu mentioned, for strategic over-the-horizon thinking.
2 minutes remaining.
IPI has stepped up to fill this gap. IPI has produced over the past few weeks a series of think pieces that identify the major future trends that are likely to shape peace operations and offer recommendations on how best to adapt them so they can be fit for purpose. This series is now running on IPI's global observatory. Let me conclude by really piggybacking and adhering to the suggestions made by Kevin. We need to be proactive in this time of crisis, to be knowledge transmitters and find ways of partnering so there is opening for this knowledge transmission for improved policies by the UN. Thank you.
Yusuf, thank you for that intervention and also for the remarkable work that IPI does around the world. Melissa, maybe I could turn to you next, if I may, and open up a discussion maybe on the other side of the agenda, namely on issues of global development, of course. So Melissa Leach, is Director of the Institute for Development Studies in the UK. Thanks for joining us, Melissa. And I wonder if I could ask you, how do we advance an agenda to better meet the combined challenges of sustainability and social justice? It's an area I know that you have dedicated much of your career, and your organization, IDS, has certainly been very focused in that space. And then maybe a second part question as well. What has specifically IDS done and been doing in this area, and with which UN agencies? I wonder if you could give us some concrete examples.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jim, for getting us together here. I'd just like to step back quickly before getting to your questions to recognise that the history of the UN is inextricably sort of entwined with the history of development and development ideas and policy and practice. And actually IDS has been part of that history from the beginning. As Richard Jolly's intellectual history outlined, he of course was one of our previous directors, but other big figures important to the founding of IDS, Dudley Sears, Hans Singer, Paul Streeton, are deeply part of this development pillar. And I think that legacy continues. And I would very much agree with the points that have been made about the role of think tanks and institutions like IDS in helping to feed and foster the big ideas, the big paradigm changes in the UN, whether one's talking about human development, human rights, basic needs, redistribution with growth. But in recent times, this rich interaction at IDS has absolutely continued. And amidst crises of climate and environmental change, of inequalities and of health, what we've been doing is to bring ideas and evidence and action to show how and why development absolutely now must be sustainable, inclusive development together. So for example, 2012, our Participate network used action research methods to bring the voices of some of the world's most poorest and marginalized people into the high-level panel formulating the UN global goals, resulting in that vital cross-cutting commitment to leave no one behind. And since then, we've been interacting with a variety of UN agencies to make that real through articulating approaches that include those living with disabilities, gender injustice, religious discrimination, modern slavery and child labour, and more. We've also engaged intensively with UNESCO on the importance of cultural diversity in development, and co-led the World Social Science Report in 2016 on challenging inequalities, which showed why a multiple inequalities approach is needed beyond the economic to address the social, the political, and the cultural, as well as the environmental. We worked with UN Women 2014 to lead their world survey on the status of women in development, which focused at that point on gender equality and sustainable development, and articulated a novel pathways approach to bring those concerns together. And we've worked intensively with UNEP on the synergies between environmental and other sustainable development goals, particularly identifying how to avoid dangerous trade-offs where environmental protection or carbon action in forestry ends up protecting the environment while creating green grabs that actually dispossess people of their land and their rights to an existence. I'm currently part of the advisory group for this year's Human Development Report, which is focusing on sustainability and development. And we're running the Social Science in Humanitarian Action platform, which was founded by, with support from UNICEF, which is bringing social science knowledge and action into the hands of responding agencies, at the moment at the forefront of the COVID crisis, but also related to other health and conflict issues, bridging the divide between humanitarian and development thinking and getting long-term knowledge into the hands of people in real time. So I think all these examples show, and I think we've learned along the way, a few key things. One is that these concerns about environmental sustainability, social equity and health absolutely have to be pursued together. There are really important synergies amongst them. The SDGs, the global goals, are really important, but they're a package and we need to address them together. Secondly, that we need really transformative action to deliver, to confront the scale and the depth of the challenges that we're now facing across the world, and that this can really helpfully combine seeds of transformation from below.
Melissa, you have frozen in your transmission.
We do this. We've Jim, with your permission, will let me turn to, well, Melissa gets back online. Why don't I turn to Latoya, and then we'll come back to Melissa and let her finish her her thought there. Latoya,
Brian, the show must go on. So
the show must go on again. The show must go on. Latoya, you're right there, I know. Latoya Waha is the Deputy Director of Political Dialogue Asia for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Welcome, Latoya. You have long studied an issue, I think, that cuts across that divide that has been referred to between security and development. And of course, there are many issues that do so. But what are the particular challenges that forced mass migration, if we can focus on an area that I know you have spent much of your career focused on? I wonder if you could talk about the particular challenges that, as I say, forced mass migration poses for international cooperation, specifically for the UN system.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. Let me start with answering your question. When it comes to forced mass migration, the international attention focuses on immediate problems, that is, the immediate political, social, or natural disaster forcing people to leave, the people on the move and the security on the way, and the satisfaction of the people's immediate basic needs once they have reached a safer place. The UN thereby is a central player in establishing frameworks for migration, and UN bodies play central roles in organizing support and immediate relief to the people who were forced to leave their homes. And several more recent refugee crises have made very clear that forced mass migration is an international problem which requires international cooperation to tackle it. But what appears to be frequently forgotten is that forced mass migration is a complex problem, and that focusing on security of people on the move and the subsequent provision of public goods or basic goods is not sufficient, nor is the sole focus on the refugees itself. I would like to make my point by providing an example from Asia, namely the effects of forced mass migration from Myanmar. When we look at reports from the UN-supported refugee camps in Bangladesh, we see the detrimental effects of forced mass migration on the people who fled Myanmar. But there are also effects on the local population in Bangladesh. There have been attacks on Bangladeshi Buddhists, which challenge the relations between the religious communities in Bangladesh, and there have been increasing tensions between Bangladeshi Muslims and the refugees, which also led to violent encounters. Migrants from Myanmar were involved in violence in other countries as well. There were victims of attacks in Sri Lanka, and there were perpetrators of attacks on Buddhists in Malaysia. Moreover, the issue has led to tensions within the regional multilateral organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is a grant of stability in the region. And even more, political exploitation of the plight of the people forced to leave Myanmar transnationalized the issue and increasingly turns a conflict about citizenship and state formation into a global religious war between Buddhists and Muslims. And this is also exploited by organizations like the Islamic State to draw support from all over the world for turning Myanmar and Southeast Asia into yet another battlefield. So looking into the region, we see that frequently legal frameworks lack support and their implementations lack a strong political will. Among various groups and communities on the national and the local levels, international resolutions are not known. Sometimes international engagement is perceived as biased, and frequently even the UN as such is not considered as a legitimate player. This means an enormous challenge for successful international cooperation in general and the UN in particular. To sum up, the complexity of forced mass migration and the lacking support for and implementation of international solutions on the ground are a meaningful challenge to international cooperation and the work of the UN. So how can think tanks like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung then support the UN and international efforts in handling the impacts of forced mass migration? It is a complex problem, and a complex problem requires a complex response. We need sustainable solutions, and sustainable solutions require profound analysis, legitimacy, and support. We must take the different interests and perspectives into account and should not focus on one group only. Multilateral organizations, different interest groups, and decision makers on the regional, the national, and local levels, civil society representatives, all these should be heard and engaged in finding a solution. And at the same time, experts with insights into the local cultural, social,
2 minutes remaining,
and historical particulars should be engaged for analysis and recommendations for solutions and their implementation. This goes well beyond the capacity of the UN, but the required networks and fora are the key domain of think tanks like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and this is where think tanks can support the UN. Let me give you a concrete example from CAS work in Asia. Our regional programs in Singapore and many country offices throughout Asia engage in building networks at these diverse levels. They bring together experts from various countries and from multiple disciplines to work on the analysis of the issues, on identifying opportunities for actions, and on providing recommendations and supporting implementations. Our country office in Myanmar, to name just one concrete example, in 2017 has brought different stakeholders together. CAS cooperated with IOM and the responsible ministry in Myanmar and conducted a workshop where practitioners and experts from various fields, officials, and also members of our Asian-wide network of young politicians called CASIP could provide their insights and perspective and identify the basis for more encompassing solutions for the effects of migration. And at the same time, CAS country offices all over the world serve as a connection between the UN and regional and national decision makers. aiming to translate the UN networks into the different decision-making levels and transporting the latter's perspective back into the UN. To sum up the answer to your question, bringing people from different levels together, engaging them, providing platforms for exchange, building networks and building bridges, and thus to build the basis for sustainable solutions to complex problems like forced mass migration is where think tanks like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to stay in the title of the second session, help the UN think. Thank you very much for having me and for listening.
Thanks so much for that, Latoya. Wonderful and concrete set of examples. Isabella, before we turn to you, Melissa, I think you are back on, and I'm sorry you had lost a connection in the amazing. It's raining in the UK.
It rains in the UK, and I have a very unfortunate tendency in my home internet connection to cut out when the rain stops.
Well, you were building us right up, and you've got another minute to finish your thought.
Okay, well, I just tried to put it in the chat box, but essentially I was going to say my kind of fourth and final point was actually just, so what is the role of think tanks in this endeavor? And it's vital, but it's actually about ideas and evidence of some certain kinds. And the key words to me would be interdisciplinary, it's social and technical sciences together. It's engaged, so it's transdisciplinary. It's actually co-creating knowledge with stakeholders, including actors in UN agencies themselves. It needs to involve a diversity of voices and equitable partnerships and alliances, which we've been talking about. It needs to be reflexive and savvy about the politics of knowledge. And I think can combine these longer term paradigm shifting ideas with the kind of real time engagement that supports agencies in what they're doing day to day. So my happy birthday wish for the 75th anniversary of the UN is that it can continue and become stronger through even more rich interactive engagement with think tanks of this kind. Thank you so much for my extra minute, and really apologies about that.
Thank you, Melissa, and a big congratulations to the remarkable work that IDS has done on such a remarkable breadth of, with such a remarkable breadth of UN agencies. Isabella Teixeira, we're going to turn to you. Isabella is now Senior Fellow at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CIGI, in Brazil, of course. Ma'am, you bring experience now, of course, from government and the think tank world. It's that revolving door that McGann referred to at the outset of our discussion here today. You, of course, are focused on what has become clearly an existential issue for all of us. And I wonder if you could share some of your thinking about how the environment can kind of help us address both local and global needs, how those connections are being made, and then specifically how I'm hoping you might talk a little bit about CIGI's own experience in working with the UN, again, on climate and environmental issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, James. Let's see how I can try to bring the things together, okay, considering that we don't have much time. But of course, you cannot address global issues like mentioned before, inequalities, migration, climate and nature crisis, and also pandemic without international cooperation and also international order. It's important to observe that the international cooperation system fortunately has not proven able to create or manage the innovative policy tools and policy spaces that are currently needed in order to bring all relevant stakeholders to the table. Building the necessary capacity to develop a co-creation stakeholder-oriented agenda within the multilateral system is a paramount meaning in times to act. Okay, we need an international system that is truly accountable to the international population and global society. Multi-stakeholders alliance, innovative networkings, and also coalition, as mentioned before, are key for the new multilateralism. And we cannot forget that we are living in the era of global uncertainties. People together is a time issue. And think tanks have really important missions to give not only input, but to think strategically how we can move on and consider this challenge. In CIGI, we are today with one important project in partnership with Konrad Adenauer Foundation that seeks to identify and analyze the trends and characterize the current reorientation of multilateralism, trying to understand in which directions it is changing and how can emerging economies like Brazil shape their policies to promote a better insertion in the shifting geopolitical context. The main question that motivates and guides this research today is how are the deterioration of multilateral systems and the changing of circumstances of globalization affect the regulatory and the policy scenario of the global economy. The project focuses on 3 international sectors or policy areas in which regulation is paramount: trade, the digital economy, and sustainability. Of course, that's also published this here, a paper, policy paper in partnership with UNEP in Brazil, exactly how the bilateral, showing how exactly bilateral cooperation between Brazil and China on environment could promote global co-benefits for the multilateral system. But how nature can help us, and as a former minister for the environment in Brazil, I think that I have full responsibility to answer these questions, okay? And also as a co-chair of International Resource Panel today, how indeed we manage nature, what are the challenges? About nature need a transformative paradigm shift. We have not only nature, but also social and economic tipping points today in the world, okay? And it's important to make clear that what are the blocking issues to the international systems really change. We need to move beyond the islands of green economy to address a new global business as usual, and to take into account the new consumers' demands for the future-oriented. The nature-based solutions will become a key global agenda soon, not only because of climate change, but also because of nature crisis and biodiversity loss, and also pollution and degradation, the new lifestyles requirements. It's our challenge to provide human and sustainable development. You should learn how to put the natural capital in the core of the global agenda and environmental health systems that allow the global development. How to better design innovative international arrangements to bring local needs and global needs together. A new and creative global commons debate means absolutely essential today, and probably will have this in the next 2 years. But we cannot forget what's happened today in Brazil, unfortunately. And we in CIGI really hard, full dedicated to try to bring other adults in the room, consider our setbacks in environmental policies and also challenges in Amazonia. My last 2 comments. In Brazil,
2 minutes remain.
Okay, the key challenge today are stopping the setbacks on the environmental policy and propose the new ways to move forward in the future. And not only in Amazonia, but Amazonia is a wicked problem. Problems related to Amazonia are poorly formulated and ambiguous in nature, with a diversity of interests and expectation in play. But it's essential to promote Amazonia development based on nature and conservation, and not on its degradation. Brazil lost in the past 1 tropical forest, Atlantic forest. We don't need to lose Amazonia to tackle our national development challenge. We need to learn with the past, not go back to the past. We need to tell new stories based on the future. And what it means that sustainable development for a legal Amazonia is a perfect example of national development strategy with global implication, which can easily result in benefits or costs that would be impossible for the international community to pay. The world is concerned about Amazonia. It's true that it's important to be concerned, but also Brazilians are concerned about this. The great obstacle to achieving the global is a false dichotomy between 2 different conceptions and the use of territory. One that emphasizes sovereignty and another that seeks globalizing. The best alternative for Brazil's development would be to surpass the dichotomy by demonstrating that the existence of global alliance doesn't harm national sovereignty, but rather strengthens the country's geopolitical influence and credibility in international forums. Nature can help us if you understand the role of conservation to allow the national and global development. If you want a transformative change, we need nature's help to promote better choice in the present, not only in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabella. That was very, very insightful. Shull, you are out there. I've not forgotten about you. Aaron Shull is Managing Director at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation up in Canada. Aaron, I have heard you say in the past that, I think in jest, that the ITU is now more important than the Security Council. So tell me what you meant by that. and how this reprioritization has happened. But then I wonder if you could turn and say a word in relation to that about CIGI's direct involvement with the UN on those issues specifically, and how think tank engagement more generally with the UN is changing and evolving in your view.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very easy set of questions to address. First, it's good to see you, my friend. And a special word of thanks to Dr. Jim McGann for pulling this together. His dedication to the think tank community is unparalleled. So thank you, Jim, for this, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. What I meant it'd be a truism to say that technology and data have changed everything. Digital technology allows organizations to gather information, to make decisions, to make smarter, better decisions, but it's giving rise to a new series of public policy issues. And these issues are complicated because they're horizontal. They're international trade, innovation, intellectual property, national security, all co-combined. And they're also vertical because it touches individuals, it touches firms and companies, it touches national governance and international governance. And I want to talk about the international governance angle. But here's a couple of questions. How do organizations collect and share the right data? How should organizations deal with data ownership? How should personal information be treated? What rules should we have regarding data residency requirements? What are the acceptable practices for automated decision-making in AI? And what do we mean by explainability when algorithms make important decisions that impact people's lives? Well, some of these issues can be dealt with by organizations. Many of them are dealt with through national regulation. But when we come to borders, we need to talk about technical standards unifying an architecture across borders. And when I get to the technical standards part of my discussion, I can literally watch people's eyes glaze over because people think of technical standards as the stuff of engineers and ones and zeros, but it's not. It's the stuff of high politics now. And two examples, the ITU has now set up a focus group to deal with machine learning on future networks, including 5G. They've also got a focus group dealing with AI and healthcare to determine how algorithms are used in healthcare applications. But at the same time, this is a geopolitical environment where states are moving for competitive advantage and power. It's also an area where there's economic competition. And so you're starting to see countries moving in very, very strategic ways to control this space. But let me just make one comment on that. We need fundamental principles that are harmonized around the world so that regulators aren't left on their own and companies aren't left on their own. We need to have a level playing field where the little companies can compete. And we need to ensure that we have frameworks where there's not costs imposed on companies trying to work across regulatory spaces. But at the very, very tip of this, we need to ensure the individual in this. We need to ensure respect for human rights. And when technology touches our lives, we need to make sure that we're doing so in a way that limits the nefarious applications of these technologies. And that's going to require international coordination. Now, you'd ask me what CIGI is doing in all of this and how we're working with the UN. Well, I would say we actually don't have a long history of working with the UN on this, but it's not because we don't want to, it's because many of these issues are quite new. And so for 5 years, we've been working on the largest survey in the world, the most comprehensive survey on internet security and trust, and we've done that in partnership with UNTAD. We surveyed 25,000 people from all around the world, from 24 countries. And Tatiana, in her remarks, said, knowledge and power are linked. I want to borrow a quote from Shamika Suraman, who's the director of UNTAD's Division of Technology and Logistics. In the press release for our survey this year, she said, knowledge is power. The CIGI survey provides us with compelling evidence to make decisions, shape policy, and channel resources to reduce the digital divide in a way that is safe and still creates opportunities for development. We need more trust if the digital economy is to become a viable tool for developing nations. And this is not an academic problem, Brian. In our survey, 8 out of 10 people, 78 people are more concerned about their online privacy or are concerned about their online privacy, and over half are more concerned now than they were last year. Fewer than half believe their government does
remaining.
Sure, thank you, Jim. Fewer than half believe their government does enough in this space to protect them. And 86% of people in our survey said they had fallen for fake news at least once in the preceding year, with 44% saying they sometimes or frequently did. So all that to say, this is not an academic problem. I said it's horizontal. It touches individuals, companies, national governments, and international governments. I said it's vertical, making it extremely complicated because it touches a wide swath of policy areas. And I think that's where think tanks can come in, is building that horizontal policy analysis. Look, because governments are great at dealing with one issue and setting up a bureaucratic structure to deal with one issue. Academic institutions are great at setting up a structure to deal with economics or political science or law. Those days are over. This touches everyone. It touches everything across a range of policy areas, and we need to think in those horizontal terms. And I think the think tank community, I hope, stands ready to assist. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I really just want to reaffirm that last point that you made on the importance that I think our community can bring to government. For those that have served in government, you're drinking out of the fire hose, and you're absolutely right. You don't have time to pick your head up and look left and look right. And so it's a service that we really can provide nicely. And with that, thanks, Aaron, for that, to all the panelists. And I believe it is back to you, Professor McGann. Oh, we've got a sound problem, I think, Jim.
You're muted.
Thank you, Brian, for effectively steering us through 40 minutes of presentations and a rainstorm in the United Kingdom. But we were able to get Melissa back on, and I'm very pleased that that was achieved. We always have in this live environment some little glitch, and we have repeatedly been able to overcome. I am now pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is, through his life, been a bridge between knowledge and policy, but also in this critical role that he's playing in the program, between what has taken place or is taking place in terms of the partnerships to what will be suggested in the next panel that follows John Allen's presentation, the president of the Brookings Institution. Specific recommendations from a group of distinguished diplomats, policymakers. And as I said, many of the people on the program, and certainly John exemplifies this, are in a part of what I described as the revolving door, who have had a distinguished service in government or in the military, who have then turned to serve in a different way in terms of public service at a think tank. It is a seamless dimension of the policy environment in the US. I think it is an extraordinary positive attribute of the American political system and institutions. And John and Kevin and others exemplify the value and importance of distinguished and highly successful individuals who dedicate themselves to service, who are constant supporters of the global community of think tanks. And so without further ado, John, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. In my case, I'm hoping that the revolving door doesn't mean that I can't keep a job. I appreciate your observation, and I wish a good day to all of our dear colleagues wherever this forum may find you in the world. And I'm John Allen, and I'm part of the Brookings Institution. Now, I have to start by saying I wholeheartedly concur with Kevin Rudd's comments from this morning, and in particular his thanks to Jim for once again convening this global think tank forum, especially as we reflect on the significance of the United Nations at 75. In a couple of moments, you'll hear, as Jim said, from the last panel. It's a very distinguished panel, which will offer us some very important observations and recommendations. But before they begin, I've been asked to offer very brief thoughts on the global environment and the critical role of the United States amidst these unique and challenging times. Even so, as we consider the role of think tanks in the essential furtherance of multilateralism and the vital role of international organizations at this time. There is little doubt that the world is experiencing great turmoil at the present moment. The COVID-19 pandemic has now robbed us of the precious lives and livelihoods of millions of people worldwide, with new cases on the rise each and every day. Yesterday in the United States, we passed an awful milestone of 210,000 dead and nearly 7.5 million infected, including the President of the United States, and all in just a little more than 7 months. And what of livelihoods? Tens of millions of Americans and tens of millions more around the world are unemployed, they are hungry, and they are destitute as a result of this pandemic. What's more, unrest stemming from centuries of unresolved systematic racism baked into societies at almost every level has resulted in a reckoning in many countries, my own included, that has seen people of all origins and faiths and persuasions taking to the streets in great numbers, demanding change from political leadership. In America this year, the combined effects of climate change have come home with a vengeance. Our West is burning. Our East and Gulf coasts are being battered by hurricanes grown more numerous and more powerful by the year. And the middle of our country is ravaged by violent storms and flooding that grow worse by the season. All of this is occurring against the backdrop of, and indeed being compounded by the fact that we are mere weeks from the November US presidential election, something that has put the entire global community on edge. So today, as I speak to you how the remainder of this campaign will unfold, it's difficult to predict. The US president has turned out to be a super spreader himself. So these are dark and trying times for my country and for the world, to say the least. And the future US presidential leadership of this particular administration remains uncertain. Even so, for the purposes of these remarks, I'll make the distinction between US leadership as we find it today and American leadership as we have known it traditionally. What remains clear is the essential role of American leadership, how it has played in the past, how it will play today and will play in the future, and the serious consequences of its absence in the world. Indeed, when at its best, America has operated as a transformational, not a transactional leader in the world, and done so within the context of a very diverse set of issues. We haven't always gotten it right, but more often than not, powerful multilateral solutions have been enabled specifically because of the involvement of America and the US government. Today, and unlike ever before, the world is changing dramatically all around us. From the increased role of local and regional leadership in tackling transnational problems, to the significant impacts of megacorporations, especially those in the tech sector, crafting the operating systems within which human beings live their day-to-day lives. And gone are the days of traditional nation-state governments acting as the sole or even as the primary mover and shaker in the global environment and in the lives and the minds of the citizens of this world. So too has conflict changed, with technology in many cases unconstrained by behavioral norms, leading the way towards devastating capabilities. Aaron just mentioned some of the capabilities of artificial intelligence, particularly in that field and in the field of biotech. Capabilities that can turn off a nation's power, turn off its access to the internet, or the kind that can hack into labs to steal the formula for, or to block the capacity to produce a COVID-19 vaccine, or the kind that can even destabilize an entire nation's democratic process or consolidate uncontested authoritarian control of its people. Again, these are devastating capabilities, but they're cheap by comparison, and not a shot has been fired. It's in this environment that American leadership is more essential than ever. When I was the American envoy to the global coalition to counter the Islamic State, we were able to quickly gather a significant number of partners, not because the US demanded it, but because the emergency was great and the cause was just. We didn't go in with a top-down, overwhelming military strategy. Instead, we asked the nations what they could offer. And respectfully, we built our strategy around those capabilities. The coalition of the willing, which Kevin alluded to at the beginning, that approach is much different than the approach we saw in the American prosecution of the Iraq War. For instance, where being, quote, willing, unquote, meant in some respects being complicit with the desires of the United States. Instead, it's about taking a diverse set of actors, treating them as a community of partner nations bound together by shared values and mobilizing them collectively on issues of global concern. That's global leadership. And it is here where America has a unique ability to act as a global convener, as a trusted third party or partner, and as a capability multiplier, be it in the context of conflict, or more importantly, coalition buildings or international diplomacy to solve our most difficult problems. America's role as a constructive, transformational leader has never been more important, given the problems that humanity faces now. And whether President Trump remains in the White House after November, or if Vice President Biden ushers in a new administration, either will have to grapple with the reality of a world evolving all around us at breathtaking speeds. And it will be the leadership of many of those on this call, many of you within the public policy research area and the think tanks, that will empower the coalition of democracies and other democratic entities to make a real difference, like dealing with global pandemics or chronic economic stress or systemic racism and global warming. It will be you as well who will play this critical role. So in the end, I pray America can be a leader in these vital matters during these critical times, and do so in a humble, respectful, values-based partnership with the United Nations and the community of nations. That's a constructive role for America, the United States. That's the role that it must play in the future, and that's America at its best. Jim, thank you for the opportunity to address this wonderful forum. I wish you all continued good health and safety. And with that, I'll turn the floor back over to Jim and Andrea Ostheimer, who will chair the last panel. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. It is, as I described, a wonderful bridge to the next panel. And I now turn it over to Andrea Ostheimer, the director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung New York office, to lead us through the final panel and their specific recommendations for how the UN can work and partner with think tanks. Andrea.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this second panel, where we are now looking at the strengths and partnerships between the think tanks and the UN in order to provide and also to share the relevant knowledge and to formulate clear policy recommendations. As Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, we also aim to enhance this exchange by bringing our civil society partners, affiliated think tanks to New York, to Geneva, to Vienna for a direct exchange with the UN, but also with member states. Although we discussed today mainly about strengthening relations between UN institutions and think tanks, I think it's equally important for think tanks to synchronize their work with advocacy and outreach that is done on member state level. Because in the end, UN institutions rely on the support and political will by member states. So in fact, we speak about a matrix, I would say, of ideal engagements, including UN headquarter level, UN and UN agency field offices, outreach to member states in New York, but also on capital level. And in addition, think tank engagement should not be reduced to the one-way street, I would call it, not only providing knowledge and policy advice to the UN. I think equally important it is to sell in country the achievements by multilateral institutions to the people and to strengthen their support for international cooperation in an age of increasing nationalism, a point that was already highlighted this morning by Kevin Rudd. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an excellent panel for our discussion, and I will be a very strict moderator. I will show the red card when only 1 minute is left. And without further ado, I actually would like to give the floor to our first panelist, Ambassador Navdeep Suri from India. Ambassador, You are the director of the Center for New Economic Diplomacy and the Observer Research Foundation. The objective of your think tank is to address the most important development challenges which are growing by the day and also keep the UN at its toes. Ambassador, particularly when we are looking at the broad spectrum of development areas by the Agenda 2030, where can the Center for New Economic Diplomacy serve as a knowledge platform and strengthen its ties with UN institutions and also agencies in India, but also here in New York? Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. At our center, we have a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, and within those, we focus on 3 or 4 particular areas. We look at climate change and particularly the importance of building climate resilient infrastructure. We look at human capital and global health issues, including access to pharmaceuticals. And we look at using technology for development objectives. And a cross-cutting pillar that we have is about inclusion of gender and mainstreaming it in whichever platform that we are working on. So at one level, our focus is on building regional communities and knowledge hubs so that there are no barriers to access of knowledge within those communities, and to see if we can create lighthouses and knowledge hubs to encourage sharing of experiences. As part of this program, last year, we worked with the UN offices in Delhi to create e-mobility solutions as part of our innovation summit. We worked with the UNEP in Nairobi on an India-Africa partnership for sustainable development. And we did 2 major events, one in Kigali that was mostly focused on East and Southern Africa, and one in Dhaka that was on South Asia and Southeast Asia, again with the similar objectives of seeing how our emphasis on SDGs could really move forward. To take an example of the lighthouse approach that we are working on, currently we have a project to look at the democratization of data, because that is going to be the next big thing. We are trying to build on the UN Secretary General's expert group's report on data revolution for sustainable development. And we are trying to see within local communities, how do you deal with issues of distribution of data, of ownership of data? Can communities have access to their own data? Can they use that data to drive better decisions for themselves? Can it lead to better governance of some of the development initiatives in their communities? Can there be more inclusive development? So data is going to be a major area of emphasis for us. Beyond that, what we want to see is in our own Vision 2030, what we're trying to say is, can we come up with a new paradigm for development cooperation? And within that new paradigm, can we try to see, is our architecture, institutional framework, is that suitable for the objectives that we have in mind? Can we bring in new actors into the development space, even as we look at a G2G kind of a framework, particularly look at the role that some of our top NGOs can play? They're already working in India, they're already working in educational sectors. Can we look at edutech? In this whole COVID-19 situation, one of the things that has come up in a big way is online education. Is there a way to expand them, to scale them up in Africa or elsewhere, working in collaboration with other countries and with UN agencies? And finally, in our Tech for Development pillar, to really see if we can leverage some of the tremendous energy of our startups and some of our top social entrepreneurs, and see whether some of the brilliant work that they are doing in their respective domains, how that plugs into the UNDP programs, how it plugs into some of the other UN objectives. And we've got one very important discussion currently underway with the World Bank to see whether they can come in as partners through their country offices for our Lighthouse program.
Excellent, Ambassador. You are very much in your time frame, and you have highlighted actually one important aspect that I also forgot to mention, the regional level, also of the UN system that is quite often overlooked, and particularly when we talk about development efforts, has to be counted in. And democratization of data, digital governance are certainly the future topics for the UN, and there are certain expert panels reports already out there. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your contribution. Our next speaker is Ambassador Kenichiro Sase, President of the renowned Japan Institute of International Affairs, and previously also the Ambassador of Japan to Washington. Excellency, in a recent survey conducted by Pew Research amongst industrialized nations on the support for the UN, interviewees in Japan have been very reluctant to commit to the UN and to see it also as a very relevant institution. How could the Japan Institute of International Affairs contribute also to a better understanding of the UN, of UN institutions, their dynamics, and also Japanese positions and interests also within the UN? Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Jim and Andrea, for having me on this program. Why, responding to your question, why Japanese public these days is not really much interested in UN and so forth. I think that I'm not quite sure that that survey is really reflecting I'm not, the general mindset of the people. And of course, I think there are influenced by the recent global challenges coming. And there is the impression given that UN is not necessarily on top of all the things, partly because of the rivalry between the superpowers. I mean, US, China, and Russia always bickering, and are they really functioning well? And these perceptions is more in the forefront. And secondly, when we address the various kinds of global challenges in the previous session, like refugees and environment, in spite of all the effort undertaken by UN agencies and UN themselves, things are not really improving, and in spite of all the efforts. So I think there is a now sense that UN is doing its best, but there could be some problem around it. Is this UN problem or other problem outside of UN? I mean, these are some of the questions I think Japanese public are asking. But when it comes to the Japanese public support to the UN and globalism, multilateralism, I don't think that the general public support is declining. And I think and people realize that a country like Japan is very much dependent upon the global peace and prosperity in terms of our dependence on the trade and peace and security around the world. So in terms of the notions, I mean, I don't think there is a declining of support, but when it comes to younger generation, it might be possibly the public education. So there is a role for think tank like us to play. May I make some one or 2 points in relation to make UN stronger? Of course, I mean, like Kevin Rudd said that, it's a graveyard to talk about institutional reform. But I kind of disagree with them. There had been long years of debate, for example, on the Security Council reform. And we tried. I mean, people are tired and not willing to do it anymore. But is that the right thing for us to see? I mean, especially against the current background, we need to refocus on the Security Council reform, in spite of the fact that it is difficult because the P5, especially P3, I would say, might be against. P3, I mean, Russia, China, and these say possibly the United States. I mean, so, we know that it's pretty difficult, and there is always argument on the balancing between the responsibility and the power. But still, when we look at all this dysfunctioning of the Security Council relationship, it is a relevant time for us to revisit and address. Do all the P5 or P3, whatever, should have the equal right to veto? Is there any way for us to carve those vetoes? Or when it comes to Secretary General's role and authority, he's still weak. When he needs to be elected or even be elected, he had to bow to P5 all the time. His authority is not so strongly now, even though he has a lot of ideas and proposals. It's always difficult to prevail. So my comment and point is that we need to revisit this UN reform once again. And number two is that on the conceptual front, there is an increasing challenge from the growing hegemonism, especially all those authoritarian states. I think we need to, again, look into the concept of human security, individual right for the people to protect themselves. And there was effort underway in UN before, like Human Security Commission debate. There are some programs introduced and implemented, but I think we need to get this human security concept more operational and deeper and outreaching. So it's a time for us to look into all this, both institutional and conceptual elements of UN functions. Am I within 60 minutes?
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Also very good that you have highlighted the public support the UN still has in Japan. And I think when it comes to the need to reform the Security Council, I think Germany and Japan are still pursuing the initiative together with the other partners, at least to have a kind of a draft paper where you can negotiate on, because at the moment it's still about, well, should we start the process or should we not start the process? Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you. We shouldn't abandon.
Yes.
We need to keep the pressure upon the big ones.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our Chancellor also just mentioned it in her speech at the anniversary of UN at 75. We are coming now to Halla Hrund-Logadottir from Iceland. Halla is the co-founder and director of the Arctic Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School, and also co-founder or co-curator of the Arctic Transformation Map at the World Economic Forum. Halla, for an institution such as the UN, the Arctic region is of utmost importance. It is affected by climate change, there is the race for its natural resources, there are geopolitical security concerns, and even the protection of minority rights are related to the Arctic. So please give us briefly some examples on how the transfer of knowledge between think tanks and also centers of excellence, such as yours, can be enhanced with the UN, but also with UN member states. Halla, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thanks to Jim and the UN and for everyone that is bringing us together here today. It's been inspiring to listen to the remarks this morning. You posed a big questions and there's multiple answers, but let me start maybe to provide some examples about what is happening in the region, why should we all care about it, and then go into how I think the UN could be more engaged. What are some of the key proposals that we should be thinking about? So if we start with what is happening in the Arctic region, well, to refer to some of the things that you said, to make a long story very short, the top of our world is melting. The Arctic is simply warming at a rate twice as fast as the rest of the world, and that is having severe implications for the local ecosystem. You can see those changes for fish stocks, for mammals, you can see it for people. We already have climate refugees in the north that are being relocated. These are indigenous communities in many cases that have lived in the Arctic region for thousands and thousands of years. For those people, climate change is not a statistic in a future report. It is simply yesterday's news and today's reality. What we also need to think about is the fact that the Arctic plays an important role in the global climate system. A warmer Arctic doesn't mean only changes for the Arctic itself, it has impacts for weather patterns around the world. And then we see changes as well for the global community because of the melting of the land ice in the Arctic. Melting land ice means that we're having sea level rise that is impacting and will continue to impact coastal communities across the globe. And then to make this more complex and referring to your example on geopolitics, with the melting of the ice in the Arctic, we're seeing new shipping routes opening up over the pole that are connecting Asia and Europe together in a completely new way. And this, of course, has geopolitical consequences. So why should we all care about these things? We should care about them simply because, unlike what we say about VECAS, what happens in the Arctic does absolutely not stay in the Arctic. It is impacting all of us, wherever we are and whatever class people belong to. So what can we do here, and what should be the role of the UN? I think, as many others have mentioned, it's all about collaboration, right? And the answer here is global collaboration to answer these global problems. And we have certainly players that have done a remarkable work on that stage, like the Arctic Council, that is the forum of the 8 Arctic states. And we have multiple think tanks, like the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, that are working on bringing forward new knowledge and research that can help make better decisions. So what can the UN do? Well, I think we need to better connect with global governments. And this is where the UN can come in. We need to, as was referred here in the panel before, have this horizontal collaboration, connecting better together global governments and think tanks. The second thing that I want to mention that we should focus on here is young people. The future of multilateralism and interest in the work of the UN, like Ambassador Sachet just mentioned, is also how young people think about in the work. Yeah, and I would just have to say that the work that we've done there, we've hosted multiple innovation labs and so forth, that brings me hope to see what young people can come up with when they're asked to address these issues. And we need to better engage them in the work of the UN and in the common work of think tanks, because we need their hope and we need their drive to make all of this work successful. So these are my short remarks. I hope I am within time, but thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Hala, for this plaidoyer and the need for more global cooperation on the Arctic, going beyond the Arctic Council. And evidently, the Arctic region has to move up on the agenda of the UN. Thank you so much, Hala, for your contribution. We are now turning to the US again. The Atlantic Council is one of the leading think tanks in the US. Our next speaker, Frederick Kempe, serves as the Atlantic Council's president and chief executive. Mr. Kempe, the objective of the Atlantic Council is to galvanize US global leadership and engagement in partnerships with allies and partners. Over the last 4 years, we have seen the withdrawal of the US not only from multilateral affairs, but also from strategic partnerships in Europe, but also partially in Asia. To what extent can think tanks fill the void, and on which topics should US think tanks also try to recapture the interest of US decision makers when it comes to multilateral affairs and the UN? Fred Kempe, over to you.
Andrea, I just want to remind everyone that the Undersecretary General is coming at 10:45. So we need to, if possible, and I understand everyone has prepared remarks, that we tighten it up a little to achieve that target.
Jim, I'd be delighted to tighten it up, and thank you so much for bringing this unique global community together. I'm really proud of it. I'm proud to be part of it, sorry. I also want to, so let me hit two things quickly to be respectful of the time. One of them is I'd like to provide the context through which our think tank sees the Atlantic Council, and this builds upon the comments of my colleague and friend John Allen, who I thought his comments were excellent. And then second, rather than go through a number of recommendations, I'll put on the table one big one that we are thinking about and we're starting to work on that I think could be a really galvanizing moment. So first of all, the context. The context is that we are facing an inflection point in history as big as the end of World War I and the end of World War II. And let's not forget the end of World War I was the League of Nations, and that was the failure that John Allen spoke about. At the end of World War II, we had a lot of institutions of the liberal international order, the United Nations among them, but they were built around US leadership in the world alongside friends and allies. And the problems we currently have in the Security Council grow from the fact that FDR wanted Stalin into the United Nations. And so that's where the veto originally came from. And the fact that it's still there is outmoded. So the context for the UN is in World War II, we have another inflection point right now that's just as historically important, where the tectonic plates are shifting. And I'll go very quickly and telegraphically around the 5 areas they're shifting. But if the United Nations, we want to watch whether the United Nations can rise to this challenge. So number one, we have a new era of major power competition. And it's no secret that at the United Nations, the US has been withdrawing relatively, and the UN has been stepping in and taking some of the key slots at and so we're seeing it play out at the UN. You have a contest between authoritarian systems and democratic systems. So the systemic struggle is going to play out at the United Nations. You have questions about US role in the world, leadership in the world. That's going to express itself through multilateral organizations. You have doubts about the impact of technology. You have doubts about climate change and what that's going to impact. And I won't go through I think the final one is you have doubts about the future of the international liberal order and exactly who is going to set the rules for the future. How are they going to be set? And so the United Nations is not in a vacuum. When China curtailed political freedoms in Hong Kong this summer, 2 rival declarations circulated at the United Nations Human Rights Council, which the US is not on for historic reasons. But one of the declarations was drafted by Cuba and commended Beijing's move in Hong Kong. The other was issued by the UK and expressed concern, but the Cuban-backed resolution, because of China's role, had 53 countries back it, while the UK-backed had only 27 supporters, and that's where we are. And so the UN is a representative of where the world at that moment is. And so we have to find ways to make the UN more effective in all of its various places, realizing that these shifts are going on. So it's an inflection point in history. The UN must adjust. And the US really does have to step back in to help that process. My one big idea, and then I'll leave it looking at the clock and wanting to be respectful of time. The big idea that could really bring things together is, while certainly the UN needs reforms, it's at its best when it brings together nations around a common challenge. And right now, there's no greater challenge facing the planet than the scourge of the coronavirus pandemic, not just now, but also for the future. So at the Atlantic Council, we've been backing a big idea that the UN could either be the leader on or be part of in shaping a collective response. And we've proposed the creation of a multi-level coronavirus coalition, public and private sector, to coordinate the efforts of UN member nations. This counter coronavirus coalition, or CCC, would focus on 2 specific areas: coordination of vaccine distribution. I don't have to list for the intelligent people on this call all the reasons why that would be incredibly useful. And
less than 1 minute remaining.
Great, thanks, Jim. And the second would be preparing for the next pandemic, and there we should talk actively about a pandemic prevention board. What a wonderful role for the UN to play, to prevent future pandemics through the nations of the UN, but also through the best technology companies and pharmaceutical companies, medical companies across the world. This is doable. It's not that expensive. It could be $50 billion or so, but look at all the money that we've wasted and lost through this pandemic. So let me just leave it there, Jim. Understand the context, pick a galvanizing way to go forward, and I think a whole group of think tanks could get behind this idea.
Thank you very much, Fred, for this very concrete example, but also for illustrating the power dynamics that are playing out in the UN institutions and the kind of strategic alliance that are created. Now we come to Robin Niblet, Director and Chief Executive of Chatham House in London. Chatham House not only provides research, but also platforms for exchange for policymakers to present their positions for close discussions on sensitive topics. Chatham House just recently published a list of its most famous articles and contributions to discussions. All topics were of high relevance for the UN: food security, future of World Trade Organization, accountability of multilateral institutions such as the IMF, US relationship with the UN, just to name the top of the list. Where are the areas where Chatham House and the UN could intensify their exchange, Robin? And should Chatham House host more outreach events also on UN topics in London, as other institutions, for example, are doing?
Andrea, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Jim, and the University of Pennsylvania Think Tank Civil Society Program for including me in this great gathering at this very important time. I want to say more thanks to save time. I'll answer your second question first, Andrea, because I probably won't get to it otherwise at the end. I think from a Chatham House standpoint, we'd be delighted to host more UN-related events in London. I would say we have a very good UN association based in London, which we've collaborated with quite frequently in the past, including on a big event last year to celebrate the legacy of Kofi Annan. So I think we'll probably aim to partner as much as we can, given that there are great institutions working in this space, as well as some of the other British think tanks you've got on this call. Where can we, like others, and we've heard from others, intensify our work with the UN? I suppose just two framing comments very quickly. One is that there's unlikely to be a return to any real type of multilateralism soon. Although I appreciate John Allen's comments about US leadership, I think the US is going to have a tough time recovering from this period of deep introspection. I don't see any other powers stepping up credibly to provide public goods in that kind of positive hegemonic way, the way the US did back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Really, in today's world, it strikes me, secondly, that governments cannot deliver the change. They cannot deliver the change alone on dealing with climate change, on dealing with women's inclusion, and dealing with the SDGs in general, even in dealing with cybersecurity. So as I look to the future and think about the kind of collaboration we'd want to undertake with the UN, we need to think more about informal networks, structures. Really, it's the two halves of Jim's program. It's the think tanks and civil society that really need to step up. And we as think tanks, I think Tom Weiss was implying this as well, need to take more of the lead in enabling those civil society networks to come together to provide support for the governments that want to make change. So our convening, our ideas will become, as the World Economic Forum puts it, more multi-stakeholder in their focus. How does that fit with the UN? I suppose, the UN, ever since Kofi Annan's day, has talked about more of a global compact, a more inclusive approach to global governance. I think what we need to do in our case is think more about also the UN agencies, not just the UN, New York or Geneva. And given that this is our centenary year, founded 100 years ago, we're trying to think about our own future. We've got three goals which kind of would fit with a UN agenda, and I'll finish up with, therefore, 5 points that would fit under them. Number one, how do you push sustainable and equitable growth in today's world? Land use, regenerative use of the land economy. Humans live mostly on land, although we rely hugely on the oceans. I think a lot more focus with the FAO on better land use and ensuring that we have the capacity to sustain our growing population will be critical. Second, universal healthcare. Fred Kempe very rightly mentioned the kind of steps that need to be taken to come out of COVID. But one thing we know, both from other examples and under the SDGs, is the importance of universal healthcare systems to ensure equitable delivery of health systems. I think working with the WHO, we have a Center on Universal Health Security at Chatham House. We look to working very closely with the WHO on this. And third, climate change, obviously, everyone's working on it. I think a space where we and other think tanks can make a difference is building up human agency. Again, if we leave this all to governments or the big actors, we're not going to achieve the change we need. And whether it's on changing diet, or whether it's on thinking about our fashion sense and our clothing use, our individual use of energy, think tanks can really get the message out that individuals can make a difference. Fourth point, under kind of peaceful and thriving societies, our second goal, I think frontier technology is a critical area where think tanks, including Chatham House, need to team up with UN agencies and others. And I think the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation gives us some real space to work, especially on ensuring the protection of human rights in the digital era. And Aaron Schul, I thought, was quite right on his points on this. And my last one is really about accountability and transparency. Our third goal is inclusive and accountable governance. You're going to need more inclusivity and accountability in the big UN agencies of the WTO, of the World Bank and the IMF. For them to be credible in the future, they need to have much more transparency and engagement by other actors inside it. So I'll finish up there. I think there's a very strong agenda to be able to undertake for all of us with the UN system. Let's think about a multi-stakeholder approach to it, and let's pick some of the agencies that are working really hard to make a difference. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Robin, for these very concrete examples, but also for your call on think tanks to have a more proactive, more leading role in bringing the multi-stakeholder approach into policy discussions. Now over to Thierry de Montbrial. Thierry, you are the founder and executive chairman of IFRI, the leading French think tank in international relations. IFRI also qualified as the second most influential one worldwide in the think tank ranking. The analysis and also the studies IFRI provides are widely read, much appreciated, particularly amongst European decision makers and EU institutions. So if you compare the access and influence on EU level with the one that you have with the UN, how would you like to see a strengthened relationship between IFRI and the UN in the future? And on which topics do you particularly see interest for cooperation?
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. I will try to answer your question indirectly and in 3 points, because I am Frenchman. First point is, yes, IFRI works much more with the think tanks of other countries, not only, of course, European think tanks, but worldwide think tanks, and Chatham House, Mr. Ambassador Sassai here, and many others. But so far, we haven't worked much with the UN, except within the framework of the World Policy Conference, where we invite regularly representatives, high representatives from UN institutions. But the reason why it is so, I think, is that it's very difficult to discuss policy issues with the UN. Let's be very, very frank. And this takes me to my second point. I think that before talking about the future of the UN and how we can talk with them on specific issues from a policy viewpoint, we have to have a clear diagnosis of what the situation is. I understand that you have discussed a lot of this before this session, but let me make a few very blunt points. First, what is dominating the international scene today is the return to a kind of 19th century policy. We are very far away from the UN ideal. And the scene will be dominated, at least for the next 30 years, by the US-American competition. And unfortunately, the US, especially under President Trump, has shown unprecedented disrespect for multilateralism, international law. And many of us, such as the Europeans, are the victims in a very concrete sense, because the sanctions policy of the United States, I'm thinking of course of the GCPOA, is like treating allies like fools. We are the victims of the sanctions. And I am not totally sure that there would be a complete reversal of the situation, even if Vice President Biden were elected. And as a result of all this, the international scene looks, as I said, more like 19th century, as we are seeing these very days in the Middle East. The latest event being the situation with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Where is the UN? Where is the UN? Nowhere. So we have to be very lucid about the situation.
It's remaining.
And I think that the first question on the problem you are raising is to clarify the relationship between the US and the UN. And we at IFRI, I'm sure Chatham House as well, and Ambassador Sassai said a few things very close to that. The first thing to do would be to work together, and with the UN, how should we improve? How is it possible to improve the US-UN relations? And my third and last point is that clearly we see two opposite trends today. One trend is deglobalization, and the opposite trend is the increased need for multilateralism and for global cooperation in all the issues which have been mentioned. And I will end by saying that the real problem is not to discuss about topics. We all know the topics. What we have to discuss is how is it possible to have discussions, think tank discussions with the UN in directions which would make the UN more effective, more efficient. That is the big question.
Thank you very
much. If I could intervene here and beg your indulgence that we dispense with an introduction of the ambassador. And Ambassador, I appreciate your understanding so that we can keep to the time.
Okay, then I'm handing over directly to Ambassador Antonio Patriota.
Thank you very much. I'll try to fit in 4 points into 6 minutes. Thank you, Jim, again, Kevin Rudd, and the many friends who have made interesting points. I'll try not to be repetitive. There is a consensus today that due to COVID-19, we need to rebuild better as we look at the economic, social, and health challenges of the future. And we have a roadmap to some degree in the 2030 agenda. But one of the SDGs is a kind of orphan, and I think it deserves greater attention. I'm thinking of SDG 10 on inequality within and among nations. This is an area where I think think tanks, academia, the private sector, the UN should come together, because there's a general feeling that rising inequality is really inimical and could even jeopardize efforts at improving economic growth and social equity in the future. So I have a suggestion to make here. Not only, I think, do think tanks and the UN play a central role, but perhaps look at the World Economic Forum. The Davos has demonstrated extraordinary convening power to bring together representatives from businesses worldwide. They also have the importance of inequality in their radar and in their agenda. And I see scope for a more inclusive and interesting and productive conversation there. The second point deals with something that I think nobody mentioned today, but that is of great concern to many of us, which is the fact that the world is on higher nuclear alert than it has been for decades. And what we see is a breakdown in disarmament and arms control, whether bilateral or within the UN. The Geneva Conference on Disarmament hasn't produced any results in decades. And yet there's an interesting development that I think deserves our attention. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded in 2017 to the International Coalition for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. And it is thanks to this coalition made up of NGOs and civil society
that a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was negotiated and has been signed, I think, by almost sufficient number of countries for it to come into force. Now, no one is under any illusions that nuclear weapons will disappear because of this treaty. But I think it's an example of how the UN can work with civil society to kind of advance the debate and to look beyond what is possible, maybe even for this generation, but certainly there will be no 100th anniversary if we have a nuclear war between now and then. Third, I'd like to refer to a speech by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, where he speaks of the great fracture as the biggest danger we are facing now. Now, the great
Less than 1 minute remaining.
Has been mentioned by many. This is, China, the US, each with its own trade and financial rules and internet and artificial intelligence capabilities. How does UN help to diffuse this great fracture? And here I have a suggestion to make. Kofi Annan convened a panel of eminent persons when he thought the UN was facing a fork in the road. I would say the fork in the road today is much deeper, much more momentous for future generations. And he should convene a debate with eminent persons, think tanks, business leaders that will include representatives from all mindsets. And some of these debates, like the one we're having today, are very helpful, but I feel the need for engaging the Chinese, the Russians, all the mindsets. Without their participation, it will be very difficult to build a multilateralism that is perceived internationally as working to the benefit of everyone. And finally, to respond to Andrea's idea that think tanks and UN should be a two-way street, I think there's a role that think tanks can play in raising awareness as to the importance of Security Council reform. Really, if in 25 years we have not reformed the Security Council, its irrelevance will have become complete. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thanks to all panelists for these excellent contributions. We have touched on many issues that really value to be discussed in more depth, and hopefully one of the think tank summits Jim is convening also regionally might take up one or the other issue, and we can follow up on that. And I hand over to Jim again for the continuation of the program.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and all of the members of your panel. Excellent interventions. I will dispense with a formal long introduction of the distinguished career of Fabrizio Hochschild-Drummond so that we can benefit from his intervention and ideas. But Undersecretary General Antonio Gutierrez appointed Fabrizio from Chile, who is from Chile, as his special advisor on the preparation for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN. It is with a great honor and to cap off this extraordinary exchange of ideas and people to hand it over to the Undersecretary General for his concluding comments.
Thank you very much, and I'm honored to be here among you. I see many people who have provided key inspiration along the course of my career and who I've been privileged to interact with. And I can't help but also greet in particular Ambassador Patriota, who remains a very much admired figure for his work here at the UN. I heard in the interventions many references to the fact that we're at some sort of pivotal moment, a fork in the road. And I think there's a very broad awareness of that. And the paths ahead of us don't seem very, very clear. I think that sense of being at a pivotal moment in history even preceded the pandemic. I think the pandemic has brought it to the fore, and many would argue has accelerated the progression to that fork. But it loomed on the horizon even before. And one feature of that was this contradiction that many have alluded to
between a growing number of challenges that can only be dealt with through global cooperation. Of course, climate change is chief among those challenges, but by no means the only one. And at the same time, a retreat from international mechanisms. And that retreat, I would just add from what I've heard, is more complex, I think, than individual countries growing more isolationist or nationalist. I think I've felt among the membership here a broader sort of multilateralism fatigue, for lack of a better word, where even those who are very traditionally very strong advocates of multilateralism, faced with all the difficulties there are now of getting accords, just don't feel it's worth investing the same effort that they would have invested in the past. And I think that fatigue, I mean, indifference is too strong a word, but that fatigue is almost more dangerous than the turning of the back of this or that country in its impact. So faced with that sense, which is very real here in New York, I think in Geneva elsewhere, it's probably not so acute. The Secretary General decided that the 75th anniversary was not a moment to go out and celebrate and pat ourselves on the back for all our great achievements, but it was a moment to really try and see how we could overcome this contradiction between growing global challenges and a retreat from the mechanism set up to deal with such challenges. And he wanted to go back to those to whom we are ultimately accountable, those noted in the first three words of the Charter, we the peoples. So we launched what we've referred to, perhaps a little bit boastfully, as the world's largest conversation ever, which was a global outreach effort on a scale that has not been attempted before, around 3 or 4 questions. We added a 4th question in April for obvious reasons. And the 3 questions are, what would you like the world to look like 25 years from now when the UN's 100? The second question was, what do you see as the biggest threats to the realization of that vision? And the third question was, well, to the extent there's a difference between the world you aspire to and the world you think we may end up getting, if current megatrends are not better addressed, what do you see as the role of international cooperation, of the UN in particular, and how should it be improved? And then in April, we added a question around people's immediate post-COVID priorities. And we initially started focusing on dialogues. We had over 1,000 so-called UN 75 dialogues in close to 100 countries. Then we focused, as we had to switch increasingly to digital, on our 1-minute survey, and we got well over 1 million responses in all 193 countries. And then to make sure we had an independent reality check, we also commissioned 2 of the foremost survey companies in the world, Pew and Edelman, to do an independent survey, scientific-based survey in 50 countries, representative countries, on exactly the same questions. And finally, we did reach out to think tanks and universities to gather data that they were already working on around these questions. And we put together all this data, thousands of pages of data, in a report that the Secretary General presented on the 21st of September at the high-level segment of the General Assembly dedicated to UN 75. And this is what the world thinks. This is the best ever global reality check of where the world thinks the world is heading, what the world would like to see more of, what the world would like to see less of, and what the world's expectations are of international cooperation. And the findings are quite striking. The first finding, which in this current climate here in New York is very striking. I mean, the climate here is characterized by paralysis, by friction, by verbal conflict among member states, and by what President Macron said, and his words were much more eloquent, but something like huge effort needed to achieve very little, but because of the disunity. But what this showed is the world is remarkably unified, and it's extremely striking when it comes to people's priorities and fears across regions, across age groups, across income levels. just how united people are. There are nuances between regions. There are nuances between younger and older, but it's very easy to see common patterns. And so, you know, this has revealed a level of unity when it comes to fears and hopes, which I feel we've lost touch with. I think it was very real in the origins of the UN when we were burnished by 2 world wars. So there was no end of political differences then, probably much more grave than they are today. But there was also a common unity. Now we're left with all the political differences, and we seem to have lost touch with those things that unite us. So in terms of immediate priorities post-COVID, the number one priority, unsurprisingly for everyone everywhere, was better access to healthcare, to water and sanitation, and to education. The second priority is perhaps more surprising, and that was much greater solidarity. People want to see solidarity. Ambassador Patriota referred to inequality. COVID has laid bare the depth of inequality that has grown in 2 out of 3 countries over the past 30 years, and people's concerns are very much around the inequality. So there was a call as a second priority to do much more to help the worst hit communities, the worst hit countries, and to adapt our economic model so that it's more inclusive. And longer term priority was very much about climate change and the existence of a global pandemic, which affects absolutely everyone in the way that has actually virtually never happened before in history, did not displace climate change and the destruction to the environment as the biggest long-term threat that people feel. And again, the world is remarkably united in that respect. A demand for greater respect of human rights and human dignity was another priority. What was also striking is the overall endorsement of international cooperation. And 87% want to see more international cooperation. And that 87% clearly spans political division. So this idea that internationalism is somehow the monopoly of a left-wing political tendency, and it belongs to an elitist a group of globalists, is belied by our findings. There are much more, especially among the younger generation, and the pro-international trend is particularly strong, not exclusively strong, but particularly strong among the under 45-year-olds and among women. But they don't see a dichotomy that we keep on hearing about in this country between being an internationalist and being a patriot. There's a broader understanding among younger people that we're all in an interconnected, interdependent world, global citizens, and that's as much part of being a patriot, more part of being a patriot than it is in opposition to that. But having said that, the demand for international cooperation is not a demand for more of the same. It is a demand for what some people have referred to as a UN 2.0 or 3.0. And a key element of that is a more inclusive multilateralism. A UN that doesn't just represent or privilege those who had their hands on the levers of power 50, 60, 70 years ago, but better represents the diversity of stakeholders we have today, both diversity of countries, but also diversity of of civil society, above all empowering of youth, but works better with regional organizations, and of course, think tanks and academia. And I'd like to conclude by expanding there a bit, because I think what's also come out of this is that we need to have a much more sophisticated, complex understanding of the complexities of the reality we are facing. And that our traditional way of putting on our respective mandate glasses and looking at problems, if you're a humanitarian as a humanitarian, if you're a human rights person, judging everything on the basis of human rights, if you're a development person doing that. No, the world sees the interactions between inequality and security threats, sees the relationship between climate change and human rights, and we need to rise to that complexity. And the UN on its own, which as was pointed out, I think by some speakers, is constantly firefighting and has difficulties taking distance, both because of the demands of the day-to-day, but also because there's such so many heavy political stakeholders who need to be taken account of, that a purely facts-based, evidence-based reading of situations is not always so easy or accessible. We need to link up much better with universities. We need to link up much better who are at the forefront of trying to understand the complexities of this new era of uncertainty, and can draw much more heavily on them to move forward. And that's where I think think tanks and universities have a tremendous role, building on what's has been done before. I mean, there are many examples in the past of the UN teaming up with think tanks, from Francis Deng and his work with the Brookings Institution, Edward Lack of Columbia University, our work with the Carnegie Endowment, with IDS in the UK. I mean, there are now in South Africa on peacekeeping training. There are many examples, but I think there's a strong sense that that needs to be fortified. And that sense comes from the Secretary General. He wants a much more thinking, reflective organization. And I think that's also been evidenced by the systematic manner in which he's brought big thinkers into senior management meetings. He's organized retreats with leading thinkers to try and infuse our consideration of broader policy issues better with the thinking from outside. Now, to come back to UN 75, the high-level declaration, and I think in New York, as much as we're somehow paralyzed, among diplomats, there is a strong sense of the need for renovation. And if you look at the parallel to our initiative to reach out to people, member states negotiated the UN 75 declaration, which if you compare it, I'm not saying one should necessarily invest one's time that way, with the 50th declaration, it's extremely forward-looking. It talks about the rising challenges in the future. It sets an agenda for future challenges, and that includes, for example, for the first time, looking at the impact of the transformation of digital technologies on our societies, as well as more familiar challenges like climate change, like inequality, like gender marginalization, etc. But it tasked the Secretary General with a very open-ended mandate to come back with a report about exactly how the organization can be renewed to better tackle these challenges of our new age, to better deal with this. And I know that that process will be done in a manner that reaches out to think tanks, the benefits of the ideas. We're also feeding in to that process, not only what we've gathered from We the Peoples, but also what we've gathered from all the work done by universities and think tanks over the past 5 years on UN topics. And I know there's already an outreach process underway to prepare this report. So I think moving forward, making us a more reflective organization that can better understand this strange new world will be critical, and that will be unachievable without strengthening the partnership we already have with think tanks and universities globally. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Undersecretary. It is an excellent summary of where we can partner in the future, touching on many of the extraordinary ideas that were discussed by the various panelists of what institutions have done, what they suggest needs to be done, and where think tanks can partner with the UN, and where the UN can work to make it easier and create mechanisms where think tanks can contribute to the work of the UN. I'll close by saying that clearly, and reflected in all the comments, and in play as a result of the New World Disorder, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the COVID crisis, we are faced with a world that is disrupted and transformed. And that is a reality that will transform or require a transformation of our thinking and our institutions. Ideas and words are not enough. We must, as institutions, be and serve as catalysts not only for ideas, but for action. We need, and the reality of this world transformed and disrupted is there will be no new normal. The transformation that is taking place, the disruptions, will be constant, and we will be required to adapt to a series of abnormal events, of extraordinary events, and our institutions need to be prepared for that new reality. All organizations will have to become, and I'm including the UN in this, will have to become smarter, better, faster, more digital, and above all else, agile, and engage in partnerships. The reality is that those institutions going forward who do not embrace that or have not already embraced it will be what I describe as the COVID effect, that either it will be the accelerator for your institution or the terminator. The reality is many institutions will not survive this period and or will be so weakened that their effectiveness will be diminished. We should not, we must not be diminished or stymied by these challenges, by protectionism, by nationalism, by nativism. We need to move forward in an aggressive fashion to address these global challenges together. And if there's one thing that is clear from the literature, cross-sectorally, is that partnerships and forging partnerships with institutions within a sector, and more importantly across sectors, is going to be key. And that is a clear message here. Partnering with IGOs, with corporations, and with NGOs is going to be critical going forward, not only for the survival of our institutions, but more importantly, for the survival of our planet. And it is critical that we embrace that, and that the UN seizes upon this opportunity with 500 think tanks and the people that are represented on this panel to embrace them, to partner with them as we address these critical existential threats that we face. I want to thank all of the panelists and all of the speakers for their inspiring and insightful comments that will help us forge a not only secure but sustainable future. Thank you all, and we have kept fairly close to time, which is always the hair-raising challenge in terms of these digital events. But despite all impediments, you have done an excellent job, and thank you all. And let's keep moving forward in terms of these things.